So, a lot's been going on recently.
That chart
Let's talk about action movies. Not so much just action movies, but what the villains of action movies say about the time that we're living in, the time that they were made in, and ultimately who we were during that time as a society. Much like the horror genre, action movies and their antagonists, in a lot of ways, reflect and represent the anxieties of the generation and times that they were made in. Take the theme of almost any action movie you can think of, and with enough thought and consideration of that movie's themes, the villain, and the hero that they pose against that villain, you can likely pinpoint the dominant socio-political issue happening around the time that that movie was made. In the late 90s or early 2000s, you'll find a lot of technologically savvy villains, mirroring the world's general anxiety and the unknown, scary potential of the internet that's fucking us over daily today. There's something that's distinct about each era of action films and their villains specifically that help define that generation and help define the issues that that generation cared about. I'm gonna get a little generous with what I'm defining as an action movie, so actually no one cares. I'm just gonna get started. With a few exceptions in the 70s, action movies didn't really hit their stride or differentiate themselves from the spy and Western movies of the 60s and 70s until around the 80s. There are probably a shit ton of different types of villains that you can identify throughout the 1980s and early 90s. I'm just gonna focus on a couple that I think are especially indicative of 1980s socio-political issues. The foreign threat. During the 1980s, we were essentially renewing the tensions of the Cold War, resulting in the action movies of the 80s centering mostly Russian villains. Ivan Drago and Rocky IV, the entire USSR in Escape from New York, Lieutenant Colonel Podolsky in Rambo First Blood Part 2, the entire USSR again in Red Dawn. This villain definitely carried over into the 90s, and if you ask me, we're likely to see some kind of resurgence sometime in the 2020s, especially with the recent Ukraine invasion, and depending on how we respond with the whole no-fly zone situation. The motive of the Russian enemy archetype typically centered some mix of world domination and communism, but honestly, to most Americans, those are like the same thing. This villain was always posed against some form of an American patriot or value. An American hero that stood against whatever crimes against humanity that this foreign threat committed. Speaking of crimes, that brings me to the second archetype for the 80s. Fresh off of Nixon's tough on crime policies, Reagan's America loved them a cop movie, baby. This subgenre often champions some form of active or retired ex-CIA agent, cop, veteran, in their quest to stop corruption and punch their way to peace, baby. Tango and Cash, Midnight Run, RoboCop, Beverly Hills Cop. The media made it clear to citizens that the 80s were quite possibly the most dangerous time to be alive, and the only thing that could save them was a cop. I mean, the stats show, and I'm gonna put them in the description, that crime peaked somewhere in 91. So you continue to see the street criminal versus the cop in a ton of action movies well into the 1990s. I mean, you gotta talk about Heat. Come on, baby! Come on, baby! What's interesting about the street villain of the 80s is that they're just dudes. There's nothing especially threatening about them other than the fact that they clearly aren't afraid of prison. There's no gadgets, there's no special combat skills, there's just a dedicated string of felonies and a switchblade. That's enough to piss off NYPD for like a 2-hour movie. The street criminal villain of the 1980s, I think, in terms of what it means about society in the 1980s, it's the end of the hippie free love era of the 1970s. The media and action films of that time did not let up from the narrative that the streets of America were crime-ridden and that cops were the only things that could save us. But with the turn of the decade, it seems that this narrative of cops know best starts to shift. With the 80s already representing pretty much every conceivable criminal ever, and like I said, after 1991, the crime rate starts to drop from that peak. The action film genre of the 90s couldn't rely on street muggings and homicides to carry the genre anymore. Following a decline from the Nixon, for obvious reasons, and Carter years in the 70s, 1980s America actually saw a reported increase in citizens in their trust in government during the Reagan administration. This trust would soon plummet in the 1990s. For reasons I don't need to get into, American politicians gave us plenty reasons not to trust them, and law enforcement was no different. Speed, Internal Affairs, Hard to Kill, Enemy of the State. All of these movies feature some kind of former trusted establishment figure abusing their status and betraying the people. And the only person that can stop them is a good cop. But what about a villain that's a little too big for a cop to handle? Some threats don't give a fuck about bullets, man. Independence Day, Species, The Fifth Element, I Come in Peace, The Body Snatchers, Space Jam. All of these movies feature some kind of extraterrestrial threat coming to take life as we know it. What's interesting about the heroes of the Alien movie villain of the 1990s is that instead of relying solely on law enforcement, the heroes would sometimes come down to a regular person, showing the power and agency that a regular person can have in a larger-than-life situation like an alien invasion. What this means in terms of the socio-political climate of the 1990s, honestly, I don't know. The only thing I can imagine is that with the early 1990s still reeling from the homicide rate and just the crime rate of the 80s, I still understand the 1990s to be an overall pretty prosperous time. With the Clinton years, America was in an economic surplus. It seemed that job stability, job security, different things were going really well. America was like an economic force to be reckoned with, and maybe there was a feeling that nothing could stop us. With that in mind, could the Alien movie have been an indulgence in what possibly could stop us? I don't know. I say this because what's so unique about the 90s Alien movie that differentiates it from other invasion movies, say from like the 70s or late 60s, is that America always wins. The Alien movies of the 70s, to my memory, really, when I was there in the 70s, they were really social commentaries, and in a lot of instances, the aliens actually win. It seemed that the alien invasion movies of the 90s needed to reinforce that humans win and overcome the alien invasion, which is fine, but it's definitely a shift that I think is worth noting, especially when comparing it to the alien villains that came before it. But in short, I really don't know. I'm spitballing right now. Obviously, in the new millennium, we still got some cops, we still got some bad cops, we still got some aliens, but there's generally a spin to it. And in this mashup of a genre, the digital villain, the technological threat, really is anything that you can imagine within the tech fantasy realm, from actual machines uprising and taking over, to the tech masterminds that I talked about earlier, to the fear of what the wrong kind of person could do with technology, like technologically reanimating dinosaurs, or possibly doctor false evidence to frame someone for a crime they didn't commit. While these films imagine incredible technological achievements, the catch in all of these movies is, but at what cost? It's all about our fears of technology outpacing us and ultimately getting too big for us to control anymore. It may take a life of its own, or it may fall into the wrong hands, but nevertheless, there will be dire consequences. The digital villain hasn't really ended and continues to perpetuate itself in action movies today. But with that being said, none of these tropes ever really go away. They just bounce in and out of cultural relevancy at different points, which brings us back to an older trope that we talked about earlier. Another very well-known action villain during the time of the late 90s, early 2000s, and honestly 2010s and today is the Middle Eastern foreign threat. This villain archetype stems from our strained relationship with Saddam Hussein in the 90s, the 9/11 attacks, and then basically everything that you've seen about ISIS in the 2010s. From there, almost any foreign threat in an action movie, it's likely a brown person from the Middle East. These films in a lot of cases don't stop at just vilifying Arab people, but going so far as to vilify Islam and treating it like it's just an inherently violent religion. Much like the Russian threat that we talked about in the 1980s, this ultimately just stems from Western propaganda who want to present an entire group of people as their political enemies and a threat to American way of life. And that more or less brings us to today. We have a bunch of different action movies, and it's a little hard to determine what the quintessential action movie villain is for our time. I mean, we have the occasional Kingsman, we have the John Wicks, we have the Equalizer. I can't really get into the weeds with that one, but I will say, I mean, let's answer the question of why the superhero film is basically our action genre now. And the answer to that is, I don't know. I know a big reason why DC Comics, I mean, grew to be what it is today is because, you know, superheroes like Superman or the Crimson Avenger, that they were able to be a sort of escapism for Depression-era Americans who were looking for some kind of beacon of hope. So it's interesting that we're turning to that, you know, towards the end of the 2000s and throughout the 2010s and now the 2020s. I honestly haven't thought about that too much, with the exception of like this space to where I was just writing down some of my thoughts about why the superhero genre is synonymous to action films for my generation. I mean, and while this is nothing like Depression era, especially for Americans, this is nothing like being the victims of a Depression era, but it doesn't escape me that the beginning of the superhero genre starts off with Jon Favreau's Iron Man in 2008. And that film starts off with Tony Stark in the Middle East, struggling with his war profiteering while we are in real time still reeling from 9/11. There's hunts for Osama bin Laden, and we're still in the middle of the Iraq War. I mean, within the first Iron Man, they still vilify a number of Arab people. I think the only challenge that I think is interesting or insightful from that is that the greed surrounding war is actually challenged. For that to make us identify with this subgenre of the superhero movie so heavily that it essentially defined the next 10 years of the action movie genre, and some people might even argue it defined the next 10 years of film in general, we connected pretty heavy to it. Action movies can be a really interesting and introspective look into what we thought at a specific point in time. In a lot of cases, I think it shows that not much has changed. A lot of our fears are still the same, but being able to trace where these fears peaked by going back into the archives and seeing what villains and threats we were portraying in American films, I think is an interesting way to talk about history. There's discretion that should be had when looking at film and treating it as it's indicative of an entire generation's opinion. But with that, I think the action movie genre tends to get overlooked for being ultra masculine and over the top, or needing an extreme suspension of disbelief to enjoy. But there's a lot that you can learn about American history and the discourse throughout our history by watching action films. It's a medium that shapes the culture and our understanding of the past, for better or for worse. I really like this format, so I think I'm gonna do another video, but I'm gonna do it with horror villains. But yeah, thanks for watching. That's all I got.